Now that we animate this overall container here, I think it would also be nice that if this increases in size, this confirm password text field also wouldn't just pop in, but also slowly animate in, maybe slide down and fade in, so that it looks like it's coming from behind the password field, so to say. And for that, Flutter has us covered. We have another built-in widget we can use to get that look and feel. Actually, we'll have two widgets that help us with that. Here's the text form field, which I want to animate when we're entering sign-up mode, and currently we use that if condition to let it pop in or instantly remove it. Instead of doing that, so I remove that if statement, I want to wrap that with a new widget, and there, to fade it in, we can use the fade transition widget. I think that's also a good point of time to let you know where you find all these built-in animation widgets. It's of course in the Flutter widget catalog, in case you forgot about that. There you have that animation and motion part, and if you click on that, you find all these widgets that are built into Flutter that help you with animating something. So definitely feel free to play around with these and dive into the docs about these to learn more about how to use them. You can also dive into the animations documentation here in the official docs if you want to learn way more about animations there as well. So fade transition is such a built-in widget. It takes a child, which it will fade in, but fade transition then, unlike the animated container, does not take a duration and a curve. Instead, this needs an opacity, and you need to change this opacity dynamically with the help of an animation or an animation controller. With that, we're of course back to where we were before. We need a controller, we need an animation. We have an animation controller, and I'm fine with that duration. I just want to add a new animation. An animation where I animate the opacity, and in the end the opacity is just a double, right? It's a value between 0 and 1. So 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and so on. That's a double. So here we can have our opacity animation, or whatever you want to name that, and set that animation up here in its state. Opacity animation is again set up with the tween class, because I want to animate between two values. And I want to start at 0, which is fully invisible, 0.0. And I want to end at 1.0, which is fully visible. Now here I call animate and pass in my curved animation to basically configure how that should look and feel. The parent of the curved animation is my controller, _controller. And the curve here is, let's say, curves ease in. And as I mentioned, feel free to play around with these different values. So with that, the opacity animation is set up. We can now use it down there, and fade transition will automatically register a listener and so on for us. So all we have to do here is we have to use opacity animation as an argument for opacity, because opacity actually wants an animation object. It doesn't want the double, it wants an animation object, because, as I just said, fade transition will then take this animation object and add a listener and adjust the opacity of the child widget for us. All we need to do is we need to make sure that we do start the controller or the animation with controller forward, and that we also do control playing it back. And with that, we should have everything we need. If we go back to our application here, and I do go to sign up, you see this fades in. Now we have a problem, however. As you can see, the space for this text form field is not always reserved, and hence we have this empty, ugly space and need to scroll when we're in login mode. The good thing is that our fade animation works, but of course it makes sense that this space is reserved, because if you have a look at your widget tree, where we just changed our fade transition in the text form field, this is now always part of the widget tree. It's never added or removed. So a solution here would be to also wrap the fade transition here into another animated container, which we actually shrink to a height of 0 when it should not be visible, so when the space should not be reserved, and give it a more appropriate height that leaves enough space for the text form field when it should be visible. So here on the animated container, the fade transition is the child. And I want to have a duration of, let's say, 300 milliseconds, just as on the fade transition. And now I want to control my constraints and set up some box constraints there to control the min height and the max height of this container, because it should have some room for change. Now, the min height, of course, depends on the off mode. If the off mode is equal to off mode.signup, then that should be, let's say, 60 pixels, and you can experiment with that value to see when it looks good. And otherwise, it's 0. So if we're in login mode, I don't want to have some space reserved here, and so I set the height of this container to 0. The max height also, of course, depends on the off mode. And if the off mode is sign up, then I'll set this to 120, otherwise to 0. So in the end, this container can be anything between 60 and 120 pixels high if we're in sign up mode, and it's always 0 if we're in login mode. With that changed, we also can, of course, give this a curve. Curve here with curves ease in, and then do a full restart here to see that animation in practice. So now you see the space is not reserved and it fades nicely and smoothly in as we animate this. And this, I'd say, is a much nicer look. Now, if you also want a more detailed sliding animation for the confirm password text field, you can also go into the fade transition and add yet another transition here by wrapping the text form field with another widget, the slide transition, which, just like the fade transition, is also built into Flutter. We can use that to let that widget slide, and for that, again, I scroll up to init state and above that, and I'll recycle the old height animation and name it slide animation, because we don't need the height animation anymore. We're using animated container for that. And the slide animation here will actually get an offset value, not a size value. Offset is also a class provided by Flutter. Then here we set up slide animation with a tween that controls offsets. And we start at an offset where we can set different values. And offset, if you have a look at it, takes offset on the X and on the Y axis. I never want to offset this on the X axis, so I'll set that to 0. But on the Y axis, to have it slide in from the top, I'll offset this by 1.5 pixels here in the end, minus 1.5. And I want to end at an offset of 0, 0. So at the position it should really have in the end. That's our offset tween, and we can now use that on the slide transition, because slide transition wants an animation that uses an offset tween. And of course, that's also something you simply find in the official docs, in case you're wondering how I know this. So on slide transition, you add a position, and here you see this wants an animation, which gives us an offset in the end. So here I point at slide animation, and we should be good to go. If we now do a full restart again, we have a look at that. Now you see that slides in from above. Now, of course, be aware that the more animations you nest into each other, the more inefficient this gets, or the more performance heavy your app gets. This here should be absolutely fine, but if you start animating everything on the screen all the time, your app will slow down. So use these widgets, no matter if they're built in or if you're building your own animation from scratch, use that with care. And do careful testing also on older devices to make sure that your app runs smooth. Because the best application with the best animations isn't worth much if it's just slow and people can't use it.